Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you today to the second and final day of the Berlin Humanitarian Congress 2024. Thanks to all of you who are here in presence with us today, and also big thanks to all those who've attended all the super interesting sessions online yesterday and hopefully today again with us. As you know, the whole event has been live streamed, so allow me also to remind you, if you like social media, please stay engaged, stay active, post and comment about events, and use our hashtag HCBerlin. You may have seen already coming in the foyer of the Urania venue, we have lots of beautiful stands from colleagues, humanitarian workers, organizations, young professionals operating all over the world. That's the exhibition of the Humanitarian Forum, so I encourage you, please, during the breaks, during your coffee, pass by, ask questions, and get engaged with them as well. A couple of logistical info before we look into the agenda of today. We have an awareness team. You can reach out to them anytime. Today they are sitting in the Austin room, which is right at the top above us. And then there's a Congress team, of course, for any admin logistical matter you may need, which you can find at the registration point right at the entrance. And as we move into another day full of interesting session, I think it's important to reflect very briefly on what we've heard yesterday. And I think as humanitarians, we've been put in front of lots of critical choices, which is also the title, right, of this whole event. So we had a lot, of course, the word crisis, forgotten crisis, underfunded crisis, and how much did we hear about funding? And it was always funding cuts, funding crisis, shortfalls, gaps. And we've also received a lot of interesting or provocative calls, I would say, yesterday, for us as humanitarians to maybe start to do more with less, or even to be political instead. And I think as humanitarians, however, we still need to uphold our principles no matter what, and we should not be put in front of this type of choices. We can still do both, we can still do our work, and we can still do this, we have to do this in complementarity with what is the real local humanitarian leadership, and not without them. And so today, if we look at the agenda, I think you will see there's a lot of sessions that are looking at the humanitarian principles from different angles. We will look at how humanitarianism works in the shadow and under the pressure of politics. We would look at how can we sustain international humanitarian law in all the complex crises and contexts that we see around us. And we will look also at EU migration politics. And this one, you know, yesterday we looked a lot overseas. Today we will look a bit more at home, as I would say. And I was reading the news this morning where my government was celebrating a new deal and lots of billions have been spent to set up asylum registration centers into a third state. So when the funding is there, then what is the matter? Then it is a problem of principles. And so I would like to leave you with these reflections. There will be, of course, also thematic sessions taking place today. Lots of important topics like global health amidst the funding shortfalls, the climate crisis, which we've spoken less about yesterday, and then of course, also the mental health and psychosocial strain that all the crises around the world are putting not only on humanitarians, but all of the crisis-affected communities. And as we talk about principles and standards, I would like now to leave the floor to William Anderson, the director of the Sphere, who will be the moderator of the key panel session. Have a lovely day, enjoy, and be active. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosella, and thank you to the Humanitarian Congress Planning Committee for inviting me to chair this session. So a very warm welcome to you all. It's lovely to see you in the room today. We're really looking forward to what Ugochi Daniels has to say. So I'm going to introduce her now. Ms. Daniels is a UN Shiro for tireless advocacy of women's health in emergencies. and also for her work on promoting peace. Among many leadership roles, Ms. Daniels has worked initially with USAID, then with UNFPA, both at headquarters and in other countries, including Philippines and Nepal. She was the UN Resident Coordinator in Iran, then Chief of Staff with UNRWA, and since 2021 is IOM's Deputy Director General of Operations. It's a real honor that you're with us here today, Ms. Daniels. We're really looking forward to what you're going to share, and you're very welcome. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Fantastic. Thank you, William, for the very kind words. And no, not yet. So why am I here? Well, first of all, I was invited, so thank you very much for that. But it's much more than that. Today happens to be when IOM's new Director General, Amy Pope, and my boss is celebrating her 1 year in office. And it's a time when I should be, as her deputy, I should be by her side. But I'm here. I'm here with you. And it's because this event is what I call a bucket list event for me. And I say this because a couple of things, starting off with the fact that MSF was born in reaction to the famine in Biafra during the Nigerian Civil War, and many of the NGOs represented in the Congress were also present in my country, in my region, in my state, in my village, at the time of the war. And to be in front of you 54 years after, speaking on humanitarian triage, is a once-in-a-lifetime obligation I could not miss. So I'm reminded by very sage advice from my own father to always start at the beginning and to find the source. So to get us going, I want to start with a simple story about Grace and her father, Mark. And as the story goes, in the early stages of the war, Mark received information from a dear friend that he would be assassinated that night. And so without thinking, he picked up Grace and his wife, and they fled through forests, crossed borders, crossed seas, in search of safety and protection. But it's beyond what happened in Nigeria decades ago, and it's beyond even what's happening in Nigeria now. The humanitarian arc of time presents us with a global context where yesterday, as I understand it, you asked uncomfortable questions, you reflected on very out-of-the-box suggestions, as well as emphasizing your commitment and courage to raise horrendous points. And these are the uncomfortable discussions we need to have because it's been a year of crises beyond what we could have ever imagined. Humanitarian crises, political crises, diplomatic crises, and maybe most important of all and the most personal of all, the moral crises. So, Rosella, you referred to this at the beginning. We know that humanitarian needs far outstrip the funds. You know the numbers and the funding trends, but it's beyond funding. We're at a time where displacement is at the highest ever, with over 70 million people, and yet in a few decades, climate is going to displace many times over what we have now. This is the 14th successive year of a decline in the peace index And even in countries that are stable, people's perception is that they are less safe than they were last year. We know there's a breakdown in many countries of the social contract between governments and their citizens, and the erosion of trust, including the erosion of trust in humanitarian action. And of course, IHL and humanitarian principles could be considered to be under threat. And yet, in the history of humanity, there has never been such global prosperity. However, this prosperity is in the hands of very few. I heard it interestingly described that the world has a problem of not knowing how to manage its abundance. And the heartbreaking trend of greatest relevance for this discussion are the protracted, devastating, and brutal emergencies we're dealing with today and which confront our very humanity. And it's in this context we speak of humanitarian triage. But there's even more. The World Economic Forum Global Threat Index ranks misinformation and disinformation as the #1 global threat. And this is what is shaping public opinion, government policies, political campaigns in a year where 4 billion people went and are still going to the polls. That you have chosen humanitarian triage as your theme could not be more appropriate. But let's also recognize that this context has shaped geopolitics, it has shaped donor funding objectives, has shaped the perception of individuals who donate, has brought about sanctions and conditionalities in the work that we try to do and the principles that we try to uphold. And it's not just humanitarians dealing with humanitarian triage. As much of the triaging is even done before it comes into our ecosystem. This leaves us with having to do more with less, or having to do less for some, much less for others, and for many, none at all. At IOM, of our 40 crisis response plans, only 4 are funded at over 40%. And it's still early to predict what the end-of-year funding and coverage will be of global humanitarian needs, which were prioritized, but the indication is that 2024 will not reach the 25 billion received last year, and that coverage will remain below the previous average for 5 years. So this brings me to the issue of trade-offs. We're often trapped in seeing trade-offs only through the prism of doing the same things, not because we're insane, but because it's easy to keep doing what is always done. However, as humanitarians, we cannot and we are not passive bystanders. We must still prioritize within our prioritization, make decisions, and then analyze the trade-offs of the decisions we make. For me, this is when real triage happens, meaning you fully understand the implications of the decisions you're taking, and you can defend why those trade-offs are made, and go very far out of the box so that the trade-offs are not measured in lives lost. So for example, and speaking with my migration lens, there's much about migration in political narratives, newspaper headlines, and dare I say, at family dinner tables, that is made controversial. But at IOM, the first objective of our strategic plan is saving lives and protecting people on the move. It doesn't say protecting some people or some lives, it's all of them. And therefore, trade-offs will have to be made to uphold the humanitarian imperative to save and protect. Now, something deeply important to me is our missing migrants work. And here, the numbers speak for themselves. And you can see the number of lives that are lost in different geographies around the world for people who are on the move. And though the numbers speak for themselves, they do not speak for the people behind these numbers. We do. And at a time when we are seeing the highest number of migrants dying or missing ever at borders, at sea, in deserts, this is why trade-offs must be made clear so we can continue to bring visibility to those who are invisible. And it's not easy work. To get this data you see here, my colleagues on a daily basis working on our Missing Migrants project must review pictures of dead bodies in various stages of decay and decomposition, must listen to the most harrowing of testimonies, must visit morgues and hospitals with personal trade-offs measured in levels of mental stress and well-being or lack of. You will not believe that this work is also not funded, and it's not easy to fundraise for, nor is it a topic that is easily discussed in many of the fora that I participate in. But unfailingly, I do it because it will not be forgotten nor disappear. Managing why and how people move cannot be left just to those who smuggle and traffic. IOM's third strategic objective is facilitating regular pathways for labor migration, especially for the most vulnerable due to the impact of climate. The statistics on the role of migration in the economies of developing LLDCs is extensive, as well as the projections of migrant labor that economies will need. I don't think there's an issue that has relevance across all countries in the world the way migration does. These are the facts, and there's ample evidence on the power of migration, which is as old as human civilization and will continue to be central to the future of global prosperity. However, going back to misinformation and disinformation, we are dealing with fear-driven narratives that require courage and clarity of purpose, not because there's a solid business case, which there is, but also because there's a humanitarian imperative to uphold. Otherwise, people are only left with the options to move irregularly and to go die or missing and become a statistic on this chart while doing so. It's a business model that the traffickers and smugglers have turned into a multi-billion-dollar venture, and it's still growing. I know you must be thinking I've gone from the first to the third strategic objective and skipped the second, right? Now, IOM's second strategic objective is about driving solutions to displacement. And I moved it to speak about it last because it gives me the chance to flip the story and speak about the agency of those we serve. Because we see a complex ecosystem of new and different actors at the local level. It's hard to access. In hard-to-access areas, and in any emergency you can mention, Somalia, Syria, Ukraine, Lake Chad Basin, DRC, we have seen exponential growth in the informal system of volunteer groups, local NGOs, civil society groups, religious groups, with an often impressive sense of solidarity. And we see the role of the diaspora in supporting their communities of origin. At the last COP, where there was a very heavy focus on the Loss and Damage Fund, I met with the diaspora, and they told me very clearly they are funding loss and damage right now because their families don't have the luxury to wait for our long, drawn-out and very political discussions. And at the same time, communities affected by the crises we're all operating in, they're better informed, they're more connected, they're more empowered through this access to technology and more able to articulate their needs and specify what they consider to be the most appropriate solution. So in IOM's second edition of the periodic report on the global state of solutions for displacement, IDPs told us that the most important thing they prioritize is livelihoods and housing for their long-term solutions. And that what we see geographically as displacement, they see as part of their solution as they want to integrate where they are. So here's some very far out-of-the-box thinking. We need to be prepared to shift our role towards one more of a facilitator, enabler, and supporter of people-led humanitarian response. But what trade-offs will this shift entail? Our contribution will increasingly be just one small part of a growing and complex humanitarian peace development ecosystem. We all know that remittances from diaspora triple all of ODA, including humanitarian assistance and foreign direct investment combined. And so when I was speaking about the informal system, obviously the assumption is the space we occupy is the formal humanitarian system. But let's think about it. The groups that I'm talking about, the resources that they bring are more than 3 times global assistance and global investment. In fact, they consider us as the informal. For them, this is their humanitarian ecosystem. So I implore you, I implore all of us as humanitarians to bake this into how we prioritize, how we take decisions. And whatever your organizational tools are, be they assessment kits, checklists, frameworks, KPIs, as well as your own personal rubric. And my personal rubric is how well I sleep at night. I always say I take the decisions that allow me to sleep at night. So we all have our roles, and in preparing for speaking to you today, my research brought up interaction in judicial proceedings as an actor or as a victim in the legal sense. And your history here is prolific, and do not underestimate how the rest of us look to you for transformative humanitarian interventionism. And it's not possible to overemphasize that as we pass over 41,000 people killed in hostilities in the Middle East, Gaza, Lebanon, and the West Bank, the guardianship of humanitarian values. This is profoundly important and profoundly powerful. So moving to the personal, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this life story of Billie Holiday. So please Google her. Her personal story is one of persecution, trial, and tribulation, if there ever was one, and she had to deal with her own personal demons and imperfections on a scale far greater, thankfully, than many of us do. And yet, this picture of her is iconic because of the flower in her hair and what it symbolizes. And I believe the flower's gardenia. And this is what she's known for and what her legacy is. And what I've spoken about has focused intently on the big global tensions and dilemmas we deal with. But at the end of the day, it is all personal. We can't do what we do well if it's not something personal to us. So what's your gardenia? What symbolizes you, what you stand for, and how do you show it every single day? And now I close with updating you on Grace and Mark and where they are today. Context shapes, but it shouldn't determine. This is why the world needs humanitarians, and the trade-offs are too great without us. We create opportunities in the very worst of human situations. I stand before you today because I had opportunities through humanitarian action in my country and through migration. And now you also know that my middle name is Grace. I thank you, I count on you, I applaud you, and never ever stay in any box. Thank you.
Thank you, Ugochi. That was very powerful. And I think it was so powerful, I'd just like to take a moment now where we all turn to our neighbors, and just for a minute or two, we just share something that has struck you personally, something that you think, wow, I'm going to take this away with me. So, just a minute or two, I'm going to cut it off quite soon, but just please turn to your neighbor. What has struck you personally about that you're going to take away? Thank you. We'll go into the mandate now, if possible. Wonderful. Thank you. It's amazing how the silence comes. Yeah. So, Ugochi, thank you so much for sharing and including in your presentation some of your personal journey, which is very, very powerful. But if we zoom out now and looking at the huge structural issues in this humanitarian ecosystem and the many different challenges that we have, and also the extraordinary context, the crises that you mentioned, the moral crises, including that, do you think IOM, and by extension yourself, do you think you have an almost impossible mandate in the coming years?
I don't take it as a question, I take it as a challenge. I think everything you have said defines why the mandate is so important. And in my remarks, I spoke about, what the business case is for migration and the impact remittances are having around the world. And there's pretty much almost no global perspective or solution to global trends that does not have a migration element. And because of, the slide with the numbers of people who are dying, seeking opportunity, seeking protection, that's why the mandate could not be more relevant. And the world needs a new global approach to migration. Migration right now, borders right now, asylum system right now, is based on a system for the world decades ago. We're in a different world now, clearly. So for me, we couldn't be more important, and it's not about IOM we, migration could not be more important for the world, for countries, for economies, most importantly for the migrants themselves and the communities and their families, than it is right now. And in the face of such misinformation, disinformation around migration, around the people who move, and the fear that is fueled by this narrative, not only is IOM and the mandate relevant, IOM is called to stand up, to be in the front line more now than ever. And that's not something that IOM is typically used to doing. IOM is known for its operational footprint, known for speed of delivery, known for getting things done. It's not in its DNA to be out there taking stands on very difficult issues, and on an issue as political and framed and constantly framed in controversy as migration. So being an advocate and always standing up for migration, standing up for migrants, is something we talk about in the IOM pretty much every day now, because it is so, I don't think you can open a newspaper and not have some headline that's related to migration that we as IOM need to be able to respond to, communicate on, counter the negative narrative, counter the politics. And we speak about facts, not fear, right? So if you don't stop me, I'm going to keep.
Well, I'm just thinking 68,406 people, and it's probably more than that. That's probably what we know, but it's probably more.
Absolutely.
And then you times that by 5, that's 300,000 stories of family members who have lost loved ones. So, the very least we can do is we owe it to future generations to try and bring that number down, to stop that increase. So, thank you. But also today, for example, the news, you're talking about just looking at the news, we see a mayor in the south of Lebanon and his or her colleagues being killed. You were chief of staff with UNRWA not so long ago. Yeah, just if you can just share some reflections, thoughts on what's happening and the horrific abominations.
So, of course, many people who know me reach out to me on this bilaterally, and I often say I have no words to adequately describe the reaction to what we're witnessing. And I always remember being in high school and learning about what happened during the Second World War and thinking, how could people watch what happened? You know, what type of world could that have been? And only to realize, and never imagining that we could see human misery on this scale. And what is happening in Gaza, Lebanon, West Bank is happening at the same time that we have the largest displacement emergency in Sudan in the space of under 2 years. And it's going almost I don't want to say unnoticed, but huge, huge humanitarian needs. So for me, it's an affront to our humanity, and it absolutely should ground us as humanitarians for the work that we do every day and why we do it, and what the trade-offs look like when IHL is not respected, when humanitarian principles are not upheld, when access is denied, when we're dealing with conditionalities and sanctions. So it's obviously almost debilitating in thinking of the scale of what we are witnessing. But at the same time, as I said, it really, really has to ground and drive what we do every day. You really need to appreciate the importance of it, and in whichever role it is you're playing. Not yesterday. Yesterday I was coming here. The day before, I met with IOM's chief of mission in South Sudan. And obviously we know the situation in South Sudan and the people who have left Sudan to come to South Sudan. So there's a town of Rank, which is the first place most of them come into in South Sudan. And she told me that over the past 18 months, IOM has moved 250,000 people out of Rank to their various communities in South Sudan. Now, moving people is not one of what you see if you're looking at life-saving activities. It's not typically what you're going to see coming up. But for these people, the fact that they could be moved to their communities of origin was absolutely huge for them. And it reminded me, in my role, just how important it is, how important everything is that we do, and the people that we do it for.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, I remember I was in Ye once in southern Sudan, and I was going to have supper with John Garang, but a bomb hit the town of Ye, and about 20 people were immediately killed. We went to the hospital. There were many injured. So John Garang sent his deputy, Salva Kiir, and I was disappointed that Salva Kiir came, not John Garang. But anyway, I look back now and wonder whether I could have had a better conversation with him. You said that you sleep very well at night. I'm not so sure that that might be true. I know personally I was awake at 3 a.m. last night just thinking about things. Yeah, what does keep you up at night, if anything?
So in my remarks, I had said that, and this is advice I give colleagues on hard decisions. You take the decisions that allow you to sleep at night, that you have done the absolute best you can, and that you continue to stay restless in always seeking, searching, trying to do more, to do better. So if something does keep me awake at night, it's that restlessness of, could I have done more? Should I have done more? Interestingly, my daughter got married last weekend. And the way I described it to her the day after, I said it was beautiful in every aspect and the most beautiful thing I have done with her apart from giving birth to her. And during the wedding ceremony, the pastor made a reference to the situation in Gaza, and during the rehearsal, he said to me, he asked me, do I know UNHCR? I said, yes, I know about UNHCR. And he said he and his wife donate to refugees. So during the ceremony, we took a few seconds to reflect on what's happening in the Middle East. And it was very hard for me in the midst of what is one of the most beautiful experiences of my life to be thinking, this is happening at the same time of such misery and suffering, right? And that, I was awake that night because I just couldn't reconcile that there could be so much beauty and so much happiness and so much joy for some, and nothing but misery and despair for others. So that night I was awake.
I think as humanitarians, we have such immense empathy. It's hard to sleep at night. What I'd like to do now is just open up to the floor. We'd love to hear any questions or comments. I know that there are some people watching on YouTube. Please feel free to interact. And also, I think there's some people upstairs. So, yeah, any questions or comments? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the room as well. If you just raise a hand. Yes, please. And somebody has a microphone. Thank you.
Hello, and good morning. My name is Anita. I'm from Near. That was brilliant, beautiful. I'm very inspired. I think many of us are. In your opening remarks, you spoke about a people-led humanitarian system. You also made reference to maybe reconsidering ourselves as the formal system. And how can you say more about this people-led system? How can we add value to what else is happening that may in fact be more central, that may in fact be more formal?
We could take 3 or more, or you would reply directly. It's entirely up to you.
What do you prefer?
I prefer 3 or 5, but maybe you want to speak directly to Anita.
Okay, because I wasn't writing it down. I'll write the others down.
Yeah.
No, it's a great question, and I was thinking exactly the same thing when I was at UNGA this year, because I was in many great discussions with young people, obviously with member states, with civil society, with private sector. But they were all separate discussions. At a minimum, can we at least all be around the same table figuring out what this people-led humanitarian system can look like? And many times, I shouldn't say many times, each time that whether I personally or the organization has interacted with people in humanitarian settings, the feedback that we get is always very different from what we typically do and what we typically think. So can we first of all start off having this conversation with all of the different stakeholders around the table and for a discussion on what that people-led system should look like, right? If I go back to my example of the 250,000 people we've moved out of rank, this is what they identified they wanted to have. And it is not typical humanitarian action, right? I actually want to do a follow-up in terms of, did it lead to different outcomes for them versus the more classic humanitarian response. And I don't think it's an either or. I think it's more an issue of how do we pull the different strands of all that is happening so that we, as a collective, can have the maximum impact. But also, what does it mean to be a facilitator, an enabler, and a supporter, as opposed to being the knight in shining white armor that rides in and saves the world, right? Which is probably still very important to do, but maybe not the most effective, especially when there is so much more that's happening outside of this ecosystem that we know. We need to grow that ecosystem, and we need to build the processes in that ecosystem that will enable people-led humanitarian response. And if we dig deeper, I don't have enough time, we will see that we have different pieces that can enable it, but which we've never fully pulled together. All of us have some type of participatory approach, right? And for how we engage communities. Can we lead with that? And can we then, based on that engagement, can we respond? Can we mobilize funds? Can we engage? Starting off with that, rather than having it a nice to have. One more thing. As I said, if you don't stop me, I keep going. So I was in a meeting. All of us have a commitment around supporting localization and women-led organizations. UN Women did a study to show how we're doing on this goal, so to speak. And when they looked at the all the ongoing operations, it was a figure something like only 27% had engagement of women-led organizations, which is bad enough. How was engagement with women-led organizations defined? That in a year, you met with a women-led organization once. And even at that, the humanitarian system only did that 30% of the time in all of the emergencies we're responding in. There's so much more we can do and should be doing, and we know how to do.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. Yeah, we have time for 2 or 3 more. Any other comments or feedback? Yes, please, in the front.
Thank you. It's always inspiring to have women speakers, not always male, and colorful women is more inspiring. And thank you for sharing your own story. You said in your speech that you were trying to do the absolute best from what you can. And me, as a master's student and future humanitarian, I always wonder what is the measure for doing the absolute best of what we can, because it's linked with the best for the people in need, the people affected, not the best of us or for us. So what's your advice?
Let me move. If you can pass the microphone down that way. Mariam, I think you have a question.
Thank you so much. I wanted to pick on what you said on the different roles that you see for humanitarians becoming more enablers and facilitators. And yesterday in the keynote discussion, we heard even more one step forward thinking, saying maybe we should move into the sphere of politics more, concentrate on our roles as advocate and focus on changing the system and not so much implementing or deliveries in projects. So that I would be interested to hear your reflection to that, because I think for us, or the majority of humanitarians, it feels a little bit like, wow, that's a step forward. I'm not sure if you're all ready to take it. so your thoughts would be evaluated on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm conscious at the back. Have you fallen asleep? Or is there anyone there who's awake? Yeah, wonderful, thanks.
I'm in the middle, I would say, but okay. I qualify. Thank you very much for this very inspiring exchange. I wanted to ask you mentioned that indeed we will have to do more with less in theory, and that obviously is not possible. And then you talked about the trade-offs, and we need to think outside the box, and I concur with you 100%, yet could you put a little bit more meat on that? Because in essence, or let's say in theory, I'm with you there, but then in practical terms, as a humanitarian practitioner, I'm just struggling how to transform. And also, maybe in 5 to 10 years, we will have arrived at a different place, but the transition, how can we manage that in a meaningful and dignified manner without losing out on too many people? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. And I'm going to allow one more. Okay, so we're hearing about how can we do the best, and what does that mean? We're talking about politics and whether we need to move in to that realm with more advocacy. I hear the word dignity coming through there about doing more with less. And then we have one more input.
Yes, just a question about what you mentioned concerning disinformation and new methods of warfare, and we have mentioned that yesterday as well. I would like to come up with a question. So how do you, as a representative of IOM, how do you see this unwillingness to revise and upgrade the law in certain way that we could include new ways of fueling conflict, and also the unwillingness and reluctance to reform the UN system and make further improvements? So I would like to hear from you, how do you anticipate your action as IOM acting on the humanitarian field but still having this political relation?
Okay, thank you very much. Right, that's definitely enough questions, otherwise I'm going to feel you're going to get overwhelmed with all that. But please feel free, please respond to those as you like.
Wow, they're great questions. But they're all kind of related. So let me see, in terms of doing the best that you can and what my advice is. So when you take a decision, so we can take any decision, you're preparing a project proposal and you're trying to mobilize funding, or you are going into a community that has just been, that's just been attacked. You need to think about what is most important that you want to convey. What's most important that you want to, that you also want to learn. And I'm saying this, you're thinking about this beforehand, right? And you also have to think about what are the implications this is going to have. And pretty much right now, every decision that we make has an implication in terms of the reactions you're going to get on social media, the reactions you're going to get from religious groups, reactions you're going to get from politicians, reactions you're going to get from those that you're seeking funding from or you're seeking support from. The context within which you work is very, very dynamic. So you have to make your best effort in understanding that dynamic so that you can then take the decisions take the best decisions that you can. And as I said, in terms of doing my best, that's what keeps me restless. I'm always thinking, could I have done more? Should I have said less? Should I have said more? Should I have prepared this way? Should I have prepared that way? Should I have spoken to this person instead of that person? As soon as I leave here, I'm going to be like, oh, Ugo, why did you say that? And Ugo, oh, you should have said this. But it needs to be a constant engine that you always have. And I'm not sharing this as there's a right or a wrong way. I'm just sharing from my own personal understanding of how it works or doesn't work for me. Which brings me to the point about the different roles and moving into the sphere of politics. I think it's a bit naive to assume in the world that we're working now and the issues that we work on that it's not political. So you may not be politicians, you may not be running for office, at least not yet, but the things that you do have political implications. The things that you say influence political thinking. So we're already there. How we do that and still maintain humanitarian space and access and uphold principles is the discussion to be had. But in terms of needing to become more political, it's a given. That's where we are. That's the nature of geopolitics right now. And there are many roles we play as humanitarian, right? At the role I'm in now, I'm no longer making daily decisions on who gets water, who gets food, who gets shelter, who's appointed a camp manager, who is being moved, who's being resettled. That's not what I'm doing. But it's still very important for that to happen. But because I have amazing colleagues working in really difficult situations doing all of that, in the roles that I play and in the role that I play and in the platforms where I speak, I can bring all of that knowledge and experience into the discussion. And even if somebody providing water or somebody providing mental and psychosocial support in Gaza right now is not doing politics, what they're doing is informing what I'm saying. And I am speaking in political spaces. So absolutely, we are there. We need to think about how we are using those spaces and what we are saying. Because the power of, as I said, the power of disinformation and misinformation is huge. It is shaping all aspects of what we do. And I had already said it goes beyond funding, but funding is core. So please don't think it's an either or. Think of how, right? And what's the messaging that you're taking in, and realize that it is not easy and that there will be trade-offs, right? I haven't finished. And then there was the point about reform of the UN system, doing more with less. I don't think it's about doing more with less. My children tell me mathematically, you cannot do more with less. 1 + 1 is always going to equal 2. It can never equal 3. It's going to be about how we do things differently. It goes back to the point about being very far out of the box thinking. And back to the question that Anita asked. Now, when I talk about trade-offs, what you need to think about, so an easy example is you take a decision to, in a particular setting, we're going to prioritize support to the most vulnerable female-headed households, right? And that sounds like a very noble, important thing to do. And in many cases it is. But what's the trade-off? We have made the assumption that the most vulnerable in that setting are the female-headed households. And I always remember a situation I was in Nepal that does have significant challenges on issues of gender. But when we actually did the data, the most vulnerable were, it had to do with SOGIES. They were young men who identified as female. They were actually the most vulnerable. Not that the female-headed households weren't, but it was actually another group. So trade-offs is really analyzing not what is safe and comfortable to do, but what the implications are for those that either we are not reaching or we're not serving or who we're not bringing into the discussion, as well as what is going to be the reaction. And I had already spoken about social media and politicians and et cetera. I will share a story when I was in the Philippines and working on passage of the reproductive health bill into law. And this is a law that had stalled for 30 years and very strong opposition from the Catholic Church. But when I came in my role, there was an opportunity because of the position President Aquino had taken at the time. And he had taken it a bit tepidly, and the organization I was working for and civil society groups, as well as the private sector, felt we need to maximize this opportunity. And me, with my energy and my, yes, we're going to do amazing things, I was like, let's go. Pretty much every single day I was in the newspaper. Something that was fueled by conservative groups, as well as the church. And my parents are Opus Dei. I don't know how familiar you all are with Opus Dei, but they're a very conservative group of the Catholic Church. And I could deal with the newspaper headlines, but what I didn't know was that Opus Dei in the Philippines contacted Opus Dei in Nigeria to get hold of my parents, to tell my parents their daughter is a very bad Catholic, right? And I was very proud because my father, who's very senior in Opus Dei, said to them they should leave his daughter alone. Now, for me, the trade-off became very clear that I needed to deal with the Catholic Church. And dealing with the Catholic Church in the Philippines is no small, don't let me say deal, let me say engage with the Catholic Church. And let's say, as God would have it, I was summoned for a meeting with 4 archbishops and 2 cardinals. And when I got into the room, I'll never forget, there was a rosary, and the rosary beads, each one was like this size, and it was hanging from the ceiling, and they left me in that room for like 15 minutes. So I'm thinking, this is to exorcise all my evil spirits. And then they called me in, and for the next 2 hours, it was like a trial, question after question after question. At the end of which the cardinal said to me, I can see you have the best interests of the Filipinos in your heart, as do we. We just have very different methods of how we want to achieve that. And I continued, now I'm saying this in a public space, I guess it's many years after, so it's face. I continued to meet with that cardinal secretly behind closed doors. I was no longer in the papers. I mean, I like to think I'm a superwoman, but I wasn't able to convert the Catholic Church. But at least the opposition was not as ferocious, and the bill did pass into law. So the point being here is that it's also very personal, right? When you think of what the trade-offs are obviously, first of all, for the people that we want to serve, but also for us individually. And you need to be ready to take this on in whatever, I mean, if you want, I believe, you cannot do this well without being ready to deal with that, and we will be called to have that, what's the word? Have the strength in our belly to do that as the geopolitical context that we're in becomes more and more, if it's possible to imagine, becomes more and more polarized, which brings me to the point of reform of the UN system. Let's see where it goes. We know what the challenges are. Proposals were made at UNGA. I'm not necessarily holding my breath. The UN is not the fastest of agencies, but the people we work for, like the diaspora told me about their families and communities, don't have the luxury of time for these very lofty global debates, as important as they are, which just makes us and what we do every day ever so important.
Thank you. Wow.
I was reading your body language, so I had to.
I was trying not to look desperate, but you're talking about the luxury of time, and unfortunately, this session has run out. So I have 3 daughters, teenage daughters, and I'm afraid I've put them off working in the humanitarian sector. But if you don't mind, somehow I'll ask them to introduce themselves to you, and perhaps you can inspire them in a way that I haven't been able to. Because I was so glad as a Congress that you had this on your bucket list. Ugo, Grace, if I may call you that, you've touched us.
I only use Grace for that.
Okay.
Not my favorite.
Ugochi, thank you so much for coming here, but making this so personal in such a horrendous situation that we have, the moral crisis and so on. You've touched us all personally, and we're going to take so much away with us. Thank you very much indeed.